Recognize myself for such time as I may consume.
The gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, Congress has consistently made it very clear that it is against the law for the terrorists held at Guantanamo to be brought to the United States. Though this debate is often partisan, this common sense policy has often had bipartisan support. In fact, Democrats were actually the first to include restrictions in the defense bill in 2009 when they controlled both chambers of Congress. Since then, a bipartisan majority has renewed these restrictions every year. My amendment is simple and logical, and it's slightly different than the current law that we do have on the books and the language that's in the NDAA right now. This amendment prohibits the use of any funds to study or prepare U.S. detention facilities to house these terrorists. If it's against the law to bring dangerous terrorists to the United States, why would we allow the Obama administration to study, using taxpayer dollars, how it would try to do this? Why would we want any administration to study how it can break the law? At this point, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to recognize my friend and colleague from the state of South Carolina, Representative Duncan, for 2 minutes.
The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of my colleague, Mr. Lamborn's amendment. I'm strongly opposed to the President using funds to survey potential sites within the United States at which to hold terrorists that are currently held at Guantanamo Bay. Congress has passed numerous times, and the President has signed into law legislation which explicitly prohibits the President from using taxpayer funds to bring terrorists to our soil and close the detention facility. Despite the law, the President has made his intent clear to close Guantanamo Bay and bring these terrorists to our states and our local communities. In the face of opposition from the American people and Congress and state governors, the President continues to move forward with bringing these terrorists to our soil. Last month, Governor Haley from my state of South Carolina testified before the Homeland Security Committee. She had sent a letter to Obama opposing terrorists coming to South Carolina. Never got a response from the administration, was never included in the initial talks. The President refuses to work with state governors and with this Congress. Mr. Speaker, no state should be a terrorist dumping ground. No state, whether South Carolina, Colorado, or any other, should be a terrorist dumping ground. Doing so would only make our communities the most high-profile terrorist targets in the world. So as members of Congress, we must utilize every tool at our disposal to prevent the President from disregarding the law and the will of the people, including our power of the purse, by not allowing taxpayer dollars going forward, bringing terrorists into this country. So I fully support this. I urge my colleagues to support it as well. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman from South Carolina yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Colorado.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve the balance of my time.
For all purposes, the gentleman from Indiana seek
recognition. Decline time in opposition to the gentleman's amendment and would at this time yield such time as he may consume to the gentleman from New York.
Gentleman from Indiana is recognized. Gentleman from New York is recognized for as much time as he may consume.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This amendment would prohibit the Department of Defense from even reviewing locations in the U.S. to hold Guantanamo detainees. It would obviously make it much more difficult to close the prison, which is obviously its purpose, which experts agree, that is the prison, experts agree harms U.S. national security. Major General Michael Leinert, the first commander charged with constructing and operating the Guantanamo detention facility after 9/11, recently submitted a statement for the record to the House Homeland Security Subcommittee, calling Guantanamo, quote, inconsistent with our values as Americans and recommending the prison be closed. As General Leinert stated, Guantanamo's continued existence hurts us in our prosecution of the fight against terrorists. It feeds into the narrative that the United States is not a nation of laws nor one that respects human rights, close quote. Former Secretary of State Colin Powell recently said that closing Guantanamo is in the United States' quote, best interest. Powell also stressed the effectiveness of U.S. federal courts to prosecute terrorism offenses, which have convicted over 67 individuals of such charges since 9/11, including Osama bin Laden's son-in-law, Suleiman Abu Ghraib. Federal courts have been vastly more successful than the Guantanamo military commissions, where 4 of the 8 detainees convicted have had their convictions completely overturned. Prohibiting the Department of Defense from assessing U.S. locations to hold Guantanamo detainees is fiscally irresponsible. It costs us $34,000 a year to hold a detainee in a federal supermax prison. It costs us $5 million a year to hold a detainee in Guantanamo. $5 million versus $34,000. And even if it costs money to build a new supermax, although I don't know why we need a new supermax, there's plenty of room in our supermax prisons for the maximum number of 91 people now at Guantanamo, even assuming none of them were released. 91 times 5 million minus 91 times $34,000 is a gross waste of money. And even if you had to spend money to build a new Supermax prison, you're still saving a lot of money in the long run. But the last thing I want to say is, why would we subject our states as dumping grounds for terrorists? Well, we have 67 terrorists convicted since 9/11 in American prisons and Supermaxes in the United States. No one has ever escaped from a Supermax prison. It is pure fear-mongering to say that a state or any place in the United States would be endangered by having a terrorist or anyone else in a Supermax prison. If the terrorist from Orlando had not been shot dead, he would presumably be either sentenced to death or sentenced to life in prison. He'd be in a prison in the United States. And no one would say that's unsafe. No one would say you got to export him from the country. That's just pure aberrant nonsense. So we ought to shut the prison because it's fiscally sound. It would remove a terrorist propaganda point from Al-Qaeda and ISIS and everybody else. And not all those 91. Some of them may be the worst of the worst. Some of them may not be. Some of them we know were simply handed over to bounty hunters because some other tribe in Afghanistan thought this is a good way. The Americans handing out $5,000, $10,000 is a good way to get rid of our rivals. They ought to be tried. If guilty, they ought to be kept in prison for life, perhaps, depending on what they're guilty of. But if innocent, they ought to be released. And to say they ought to stay in Guantanamo without trial, and we know this, the military tribunals don't work. They haven't managed to convict anybody and make it stick forever, is un-American. I yield back.
Gentleman from New York yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Indiana reserves. Gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, President Obama's policy of releasing people willy-nilly from Guantanamo is a bad policy. The risk is real. In recent months, the administration has finally admitted that there have been Americans who have died because of Guantanamo detainees who have been released. The director of the National Intelligence has said 1 of every 3 released detainees has rejoined the fight. Even if detainees are brought to the U.S. and never escape, to address what my colleague from New York said, there is a very real danger of proselytization within the prison system, radicalizing the inmate population, and allowing terrorists to have increased legal rights, the risk of contraband and access to communications. If there ever were a trial on U.S. soil, they would have the right to access methods and sources used by our intelligence agencies, and those would be given away to the bad guys. The people of Colorado and other states certainly don't feel safe having these terrorists in their backyard for those reasons. Transferring Guantanamo prisons to American soil is illegal, period. We need to do everything we can to ensure the president doesn't break the law or overturn the will of the American people and increase the risk to the American people, all because of a foolish and misguided campaign promise. I would like to inform the president that 9/11 happened way before there ever was a Guantanamo prison. That's not why the Islamic radicals attack us. They oppose our very way of life. They oppose us for who we are, not for what we do. Let's keep Gitmo open. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield the balance of my time.